a coded message scrawled in soot, a vanished antiquarian, and a manuscript that should have held history, but whispered something far more dangerous. What begins as a quiet evening soon unravels into a web of obsession, deception, and a trap set not with bullets, but with belief. Before we begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments below. The mystery begins now. It was upon one of those rare windless evenings of early November that I found myself once again in the familiar sanctuary of Baker Street, where the fire burned with a low, agreeable hum, and the lamplight cast soft golden shadows upon the walls lined with books, scrap clippings, and the scattered instruments of Holmes's curious investigations. My companion had, for some hours, maintained his peculiar silence, that brooding stillness which overtook him only when the world, for a time, offered him no fresh anomaly to unravel. He sat in the armchair opposite, his long, thin fingers steepled beneath his chin, eyes closed, and brows furrowed in that introspective tension I had come to recognize as the very gestation of genius. Beside him lay a pile of unopened correspondence, untouched, as if unworthy of attention. I dared not interrupt, for I knew Holmes's mind to be in flight, away from our humble surroundings and deep into some cerebral wilderness known only to himself. As I sipped my tea and turned the pages of a medical journal more out of habit than interest, I could not help but feel a growing sense of expectancy, as though the air itself bore weight. The silence between us was not of vacancy, but of potential. And in the flickering half-light of that gaslit room, I waited for the moment I knew would come. Holmes was poised not in idleness, but in anticipation, and the hour of revelation drew near. Without warning, Holmes stirred. His eyes opened, glinting with sudden clarity, and he leaned forward to pluck a folded newspaper from the edge of the hearthrug, an unremarkable edition of the Continental Gazette, which I had seen arrive by post, but dismissed as inconsequential. "Observe, Watson," he said, tapping a particular advertisement with the edge of his index finger. "Buried amongst the customary fare of auctions and boarding rooms is a message, or rather, a cry." I took the paper from him, reading the plain words aloud. "For discreet inquiries regarding maritime relics of the late Golden Era, reply to Box 16, Jodenbraestraat, Amsterdam." Holmes gave a thin smile. "A cipher, Watson, Dutch in origin. Notice the use of Golden Era, a veiled allusion to the Dutch Golden Age, and the address Jodenbraestraat, an old quarter with particular historical resonance. This is no simple inquiry into maritime antiques. It is a code, likely one constructed by a man well versed in subtlety, but desperate nonetheless." I looked at him in astonishment. "But how can you infer desperation?" "Note the indirectness, the avoidance of any concrete object. And yet, the deliberate placement in an English paper suggests urgency. He is reaching out, but cannot speak plainly. The man is afraid. That much is certain." Holmes stood, his mood shifting from contemplative to alert. "We are to expect a visitor, Watson, and if my reading is correct, he is already en route." I glanced at the clock. "From Amsterdam?" "Precisely. And he is bringing with him more than relics. He brings a problem, wrapped in cipher and soaked in danger." The fire, which had burned low, now cast long, lean shadows across the carpet, as though drawing lines upon a chessboard on which unseen players had begun to move. Holmes, standing by the window with arms folded behind his back, remained silent for several minutes after his declaration. I watched him, the precision of his posture, the tension in his brow, and recognized in it that peculiar alertness which accompanied a mind fully roused to purpose. "You believe he is already in London?" I asked at length. Holmes nodded. It is too precise a message to be speculative. He has set things in motion and hopes we will grasp his meaning before others do. Others? Holmes turned his gaze to me then. The very nature of code implies not merely secrecy, but peril. He expects to be followed, or worse, intercepted, which is why he reached for us through a cipher only someone trained in such matters might recognize. A sudden gust outside rattled the window panes. Holmes moved to the mantelpiece and checked the timepiece. If he boarded the evening mail steamer yesterday, he will be in London within the hour. We may expect a knock at the door before midnight. I felt an unaccountable chill. Perhaps it was the wind. Perhaps it was the curious certainty in Holmes's voice. Or perhaps it was the realization that once again we stood at the precipice of a mystery that had not yet spoken its name, but whose shadow had already crossed our threshold. The evening had turned to night with the kind of quietude that only Baker Street could afford. Untroubled, save for the ticking of the clock and the soft rustle of Holmes's dressing gown as he moved about the room. I had just returned to the fireside with a second cup of tea when a sudden, urgent knocking shattered the calm. Holmes, who had been reading with that curious mixture of languor and latent vigilance peculiar to his temperament, looked up with an arched brow. "We are about to be visited," he murmured, setting aside his volume with the care of a man preparing for combat. Mrs. Hudson, roused by the commotion, ushered in a gentleman who, though well dressed, bore all the signs of recent travel and sustained agitation. His hat was crushed in his hand, his cravat askew, and his eyes darted nervously about the room before fixing upon Holmes with almost pitiable desperation. "I am Julian Viss," he said breathlessly, his accent tinged with Dutch inflection. "And if I may beg a moment of your time, my life, I fear, depends upon it." Holmes regarded him quietly for a moment before gesturing to the settee. "You have come from Amsterdam by way of Harwich. The rainwater on your coat suggests you did not pause long enough to dry it at your lodgings. Please, sit, and tell us what danger has driven you here, Mr. Viss." The man obeyed, visibly trembling as he settled into the seat. I could not help but notice the way he gripped the handle of his case, a gesture not merely of protection, but of obsession. Whatever he carried within, it had brought him far, and it had clearly brought fear with it. "My apologies, gentlemen," Viss began, his voice hoarse, as though it had endured a long argument with the sea. "You must forgive my urgency, but the circumstances that bring me here are most grave, most unnatural." He opened the case with trembling hands and withdrew a flat, carefully wrapped parcel. From the folds of oilskin emerged a canvas, old, weather-darkened, and cracked by time. "This painting," he said, "was sold to me by private arrangement at an estate auction near Haarlem 3 weeks past. It is unremarkable in subject, a 17th century merchant scene, but of curious provenance. I acquired it for a modest sum, more out of instinct than certainty." Holmes leaned forward, examining the canvas with mild interest. "And what is its significance?" Viss hesitated, his lips thinning. "The significance, Mr. Holmes, lies not in the painting itself, but in what was concealed behind it. I discovered, purely by accident, a secondary canvas beneath the first, stitched cunningly into the frame's lining. Upon it were a series of symbols, neither purely linguistic nor pictographic, but something in between. Codes, Mr. Holmes, ancient codes." He swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder as though he expected the shadows to answer him. "Since then, I have received anonymous letters. My home has been entered in my absence. Twice I have been followed, and yesterday a warning was left at my door. What you read, you must forget." I saw Holmes's eyes sharpen at the words, his fingers steepling beneath his chin. Viss continued, more hushed now. "I am not a man prone to fancy, Dr. Watson, but I feel, I know, that I have stumbled upon something that others would prefer remain buried. I bring it here because I know of your reputation for discretion, and because I do not know whom else I can trust." Holmes accepted the parcel with uncharacteristic solemnity and laid it gently across the table. With the aid of a small scalpel and remarkable delicacy, he peeled back the lining to reveal a parchment of indeterminate age, browned with time and bordered in careful inkwork. Upon its surface were glyphs arranged in elegant vertical sequences, interspersed with strange annotations in faded Dutch. "What do you make of it, Holmes?" I asked, drawn in despite myself. "A cipher," he replied, "and not a recent one. Note the use of merchant shorthand along the margins, symbols employed during the Dutch Golden Age, particularly in maritime ledgers. But these—" he tapped the interspersed figures. "These are older still, possibly borrowed from alchemical charts or ecclesiastical manuscripts." Viss leaned forward. "So it is not mere decorative art?" "Hardly," Holmes said, his tone clipped and decisive. "This was encoded by someone with not only knowledge of trade, but of concealment. Such layers are not the work of an artist. They are the product of someone hiding something amid the familiar." Holmes turned to Viss with a sudden intensity. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" "Only to you," he replied. "Even my assistant remains unaware." Holmes nodded. "Good. Keep it so." To my surprise, Holmes rose and began pacing. "A painting that is not a painting. A manuscript written not to inform, but to obscure. And behind it all, a man followed, warned, and unsettled. There is more to this than smuggled history, Watson. Something modern and pressing walks in the footsteps of the past." Viss sat once again, his nerves fraying visibly beneath Holmes's scrutiny. His face, now pale and drawn in the firelight, betrayed the exhaustion of a man pursued not merely across countries, but across conscience. "I confess," he said in a voice scarcely above a whisper, "that I hesitated before coming. There are those who would call me coward for running. Yet I could not remain in Amsterdam. I feared not only for my own safety, but that I might through ignorance bring harm to others." Holmes made no reply, but the set of his jaw suggested he understood. Viss continued. "This manuscript, whatever it contains, has awakened interest from quarters I do not comprehend. The men who followed me were not common thieves. They knew my route. They were silent, professional." He looked up, eyes wet with fatigue. "Mr. Holmes, I do not ask for sympathy. I ask only for your judgment and, if possible, your protection. If this thing I have uncovered is dangerous, I would rather destroy it than see another suffer on its account." Holmes was silent for a moment. Then he stepped forward and laid a hand lightly on the manuscript. "You did wisely to bring it here," he said quietly, "and though you may have fled the storm, it has followed you. We shall meet it together." And with that, Holmes turned once more to the strange symbols and began, as he always did, not by asking what had been written, but why. The manuscript now lay spread upon Holmes's table, its aged fibres exhaling the faint odour of vellum and time, while the painted canvas, unframed and stiff with age, rested beside it. Holmes, with sleeves rolled to the elbow and a jeweller's glass affixed to one eye, moved between the two with the detached precision of a surgeon at dissection. "It is not the text alone that intrigues," he murmured, "but the relationship between the visible and the veiled." With gloved fingers, he traced a portion of the manuscript. These marginal glyphs, crudely applied, bear no literary or numeric consistency. They are not language, but camouflage. I peered closer. Camouflage. Indeed, their primary function is to deter cursory examination. To the uninitiated, they present the illusion of complexity. But note, this repetition here and again here. It is an embedded pattern, likely a substitution cipher. too intentional to be random. He then turned to the painting, which I had assumed held little interest beyond its concealment of the document. "Observe," he said, gesturing to the shoreline in the background of the scene. At first glance, a simple marine vista. But these ships, do you see their flags? They are neither English nor Dutch. In fact, one bears a symbol which I have only seen once before in the watermark of a confiscated forgery case from The Hague. You believe the two are connected? More than belief, Watson. The cipher, the painting, and the curious attention Mr. Viss has attracted. These are not isolated threads, but a single rope, knotted by deliberate hand. Holmes's tone had shifted subtly. He was no longer speaking of academic puzzles. He was navigating danger, and he had already committed us to the voyage. Holmes now turned his scrutiny to the painting with an intensity that silenced even my most pressing questions. Taking up a small magnifying lens, he scanned the borders of the canvas, pausing from time to time with the murmur of a satisfied whisper. Then, with a flick of his nail, he pointed to the lower right-hand corner, nearly lost within a shadowed fold of oil paint. "There," he said quietly. "What does that resemble to your eye?" I squinted. It appears to be a monogram, or perhaps a ciphered character. Precisely. It is not the painter's mark, but a concealed signature, one that would escape all but the most fastidious observer. It resembles a sigil used in the records of the Brotherhood of the Lion. The Brotherhood of the... An obscure society, Watson, supposedly disbanded a century past, though such groups rarely disappear so tidily. They were known for smuggling relics, both sacred and profane, under the pretext of historical preservation. Many of their caches remain undiscovered, and some whisper that they operated more as spies than scholars. I felt a chill stir the air, though the fire remained steady. Then this manuscript may be more than a ledger. It may be a key, my dear fellow, a key hidden beneath layers of deception, bound to an organization for whom secrecy was virtue. He turned to me, his eyes gleaming. And secrets, Watson, have their own gravity. Those who orbit them too long either become keepers or corpses. Holmes then reached for his coat. "We must consult the archives. There are dusty ghosts who may speak, if addressed in the right tongue." The following morning found us beneath the vaulted ceilings of the British Museum's reading room, surrounded by the hushed rustle of scholars and the faint scent of parchment and leather binding. Holmes moved with the purposeful gait of a man in command of his own legend, requesting volumes with the familiarity of one who had long since earned the librarian's wary respect. We began with Dutch maritime ledgers and merchant registries from the mid-17th century, many of which were bound in near-crumbling boards and written in the dense, looping script of that era. Holmes passed over most with only cursory inspection, until one, thinner than the rest and marked in faded red ink, arrested his attention. "Here," he said, "Guild records from the New Handelskamer of Amsterdam, 1667. Note the seal upon the inner flap. 2 lions flanking a stylized key. The same motif appears in the ciphered manuscript." The clerk, overhearing our quiet exchange, offered a knowing glance. "That symbol's been seen before. We had a scholar from Utrecht last winter researching similar emblems. Said they belonged to a defunct trading guild involved in less than legal exchanges." "Espionage?" I asked. "Among other things," the clerk said, and disappeared into the rows of shelves. Holmes turned a page with care, revealing a listing of names, transactions, and cryptic notations, one of which bore a familiar initial. "J.V., he murmured. "Julian Viss, an ancestor perhaps." "No," I said, suddenly recalling the look on our client's face. "He told us the painting came by auction, but he never said how it was found, only that it was meant for him." Holmes gave me a sharp look. "Then we are being managed, Watson, and the truth may be buried beneath gilt as much as ink." It was then amidst the whispering shelves, that I began to understand. This was no mere theft or forgery. We stood on the edge of something older, something steeped in secrecy and still watched by unseen eyes. It was upon Holmes's suggestion that we sought an appointment at the Dutch embassy that very afternoon, under the pretext of verifying the origins of the painting and its associated documentation. The ambassador, a stately gentleman by the name of Van den Meer, received us in a private study, where the air smelled faintly of cigars and sealed envelopes. Though courteous, he regarded us with the polite suspicion that foreign diplomats often reserve for Englishmen who ask too many questions. Holmes wasted little time on pleasantries. We have in our possession an item of uncertain provenance, a painting acquired recently by a private collector in Amsterdam. It bears markings of possible connection to a historical society or trade guild long believed dormant. Van den Meer raised a brow. You refer, I assume, to the Broederschap van de Leeuw. The Brotherhood of the Lion, I translated aloud. The ambassador leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. That name has not passed these walls in many years. An archaic order, half legend, half scandal. In the 17th century, they acted as intermediaries between merchant houses and certain less savoury elements of colonial power, a shadow within a shadow, as it were. But you will find little in our official records. Their existence was quietly expunged, along with their sins. Holmes offered a faint smile. And yet their marks endure, in paint, parchment, and cipher. Van den Meer narrowed his gaze. If what you possess bears their seal, Mr. Holmes, I advise caution. That brotherhood dealt in secrets that outlived the men who kept them. Some were religious, some political. All were dangerous. As we took our leave, Holmes whispered to me, "Confirmation, Watson. Not only of the guild's existence, but of its afterlife. Secrets such as these do not die. They decay in silence until someone, knowingly or not, exhumes them." I glanced back at the solemn walls of the embassy, wondering whether our questions had stirred something best left buried. That evening, as the fog rolled in, low across Baker Street, and the last of the lamplighters passed beneath our windows, I observed Mr. Julian Viss with renewed scrutiny. He had taken to sitting near the fire, eyes fixed upon the manuscript in Holmes's possession, his fingers clasped so tightly that the knuckles showed white beneath the skin. I could not help but remark his altered countenance. The nervous energy of his first arrival had given way to something subtler, something I had often witnessed in patients who bore burdens too long kept in silence. It was not fear alone, but a sort of inner corrosion, as though his mind paced the same confessional corridor but dared not speak. Later, when Holmes had retreated to his room to cross-reference symbols with an obscure Venetian cryptography text, I approached Viss under the guise of idle conversation. "You seem troubled, sir," I offered gently, "and I wonder whether this manuscript troubles you more than you have confessed." He looked at me then, and there was a flicker, brief but unmistakable, of something resembling guilt. He made no admission, only a vague shake of the head, but his eyes remained fixed upon the floor. "I am merely tired," he said. "It has been a long journey." But I did not believe him. Holmes returned shortly, offering no comment on Vriss's reticence, but I saw the briefest glance exchanged between them. It spoke volumes. As I recorded the day's events in my journal that night, I could not rid myself of the impression that Julian Viss had not only brought us a mystery to solve, but a secret he hoped we would not uncover. It was during the days that followed our inquiry at the Dutch embassy that I began to notice them. At first, I attributed it to my own heightened state of vigilance, a natural consequence of the case's growing intricacies. But by the third such occurrence, I was no longer able to dismiss the sensation as paranoia. On 2 occasions, as Holmes and I crossed Charing Cross Road, I caught sight of the same tall figure. muffled in a grey coat and low-brimmed hat, loitering on the opposite pavement. A day later, near the British Museum, a different man, shorter, heavier set, with a limp, seemed to track our movement from the shadows of a tobacconist's awning. I said nothing at first, though I was increasingly ill at ease. Holmes, I assumed, must have noticed and simply chosen not to remark on it. That was until, on the fourth day, I saw both men, stationed at opposite ends of a narrow alley near Soho, watching us in tandem before melting silently into the crowd. That evening, over supper, I spoke. "Holmes, I have the strongest suspicion that we are being followed." He did not look up from his plate. "Your suspicion is, in fact, a certainty. I observed them both before you did." "You knew." "I did," he replied coolly, dabbing the corner of his mouth with a napkin. "But one does not chase a shadow without first observing the shape it casts. Let them follow, Watson, for now. Men who trail others so persistently and yet vanish so completely are not mere footpads. They belong to a more subtle class of adversary, one that prefers silence to confrontation." There was something in Holmes's voice, measured, restrained, that told me he was already preparing the next move in a game neither of us yet fully understood. It was the following afternoon when Holmes, without preamble, emerged from his chamber in the garb of a sallow-faced clergyman, complete with bent spectacles and a worn satchel. He offered no explanation as he passed me by, merely tapping the manuscript on the table and muttering, "Keep Viss here. I shall return before dusk." For hours I remained in the rooms, uneasy, pacing like a caged beast, while Viss sat in tormented silence by the fire. When at last Holmes returned, stripped of disguise and visibly invigorated, he collapsed into his chair with the satisfaction of a man who had played a hand well. "They are not amateurs," he said, lighting his pipe with care. "One trailed me as far as Whitechapel, then passed the task to another, likely to determine whether I was leading them astray. They avoided contact, but I saw enough to confirm their identity." "Who are they?" "Not police, not common thieves. Their movements suggest training, military or mercantile. Likely men employed in the service of a foreign syndicate." "You believe them to be Dutch?" Holmes gave a tight nod. "Or perhaps merely fluent in the habits of that nation's secret commerce. They do not seek the manuscript for profit, Watson, but to suppress it." "Suppress it?" "It poses a threat. Not in its content, which remains undeciphered, but in its very existence. That alone tells us it has a value beyond the parchment it is inked upon." Holmes leaned back, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. "We are being drawn into a web, Watson, and I have begun to see the threads." It was just past 2 a.m. when a sound, soft yet unnatural, stirred me from sleep. At first I imagined it to be the wind, for the November air had grown wild in recent days. But then came a distinct creak, the unmistakable complaint of wood under stealthy weight, and I knew at once that something was amiss. I rose swiftly, my service revolver drawn from the drawer beside me, and stepped into the sitting room. There, near the window, a figure froze, caught in the amber light of the fireplace's dying glow. He wore dark clothing and gloves, and in one hand I saw the glint of a blade. Before I could raise my weapon, Holmes was upon him, silent as the hour itself, wrenching the man backward in a practiced grip. There was a brief struggle, a grunt, and then the intruder broke free and vanished down the stair, leaving behind a scattering of soot and a torn fragment of cloth. By the time I reached the street, he was gone. We secured the windows and summoned a constable to take down the particulars, but Holmes appeared less interested in the theft than in what had not been taken. "Nothing disturbed," he murmured, inspecting the cabinet where the manuscript lay concealed. "This was no burglary, it was a message." A message. Holmes turned to me with eyes sharper than glass. They wanted us to know they can enter, that walls and locks are no protection. It is intimidation, Watson, and a declaration of intent. Viss, who had come down half-dressed and trembling, stood pale as chalk. I could not tell whether it was fear that consumed him, or recognition. Holmes said no more that night, but I sensed in him a deeper resolve, one that would no longer abide shadows. The following morning was subdued. Viss had taken to the corner of the room like a man awaiting judgment, and Holmes, for all his energy the night prior, was uncharacteristically still, perched in the armchair and staring into the fire, with fingers pressed together beneath his chin. At length, Holmes spoke, not loudly, but with such clarity that Viss could not pretend not to hear. "It is a peculiar thing, Mr. Viss, how often those who are pursued are not merely in possession of dangerous knowledge, but of dangerous omissions." The antiquarian shifted. "I have told you all I know." "Have you?" Holmes's voice remained calm. "And yet your name appears in a Dutch ledger associated with antiquities long believed lost. You purchase a painting of disputed origin. You travel here unannounced with a manuscript that clearly has more than academic value. And when threatened, you seek our aid, but not our understanding." Viss said nothing. His hands trembled in his lap. "I do not accuse," Holmes said after a pause. "But I suggest that we are no longer dealing with a mere mystery of ink and paper. We are contending with men who kill to keep silence, and if there is anything more you have not told us, anything at all, it may cost not only your life, but ours." Still, Viss did not speak, but in the tightening of his jaw, in the flicker behind his eyes, I saw the weight of something not yet confessed. Later that evening, as the lamps flickered low and the wind scraped its long fingers across the panes, Holmes broke the silence that had descended between us since Viss retired. "There are patterns, Watson," he began, "which reveal more in their absence than in their presence." I looked up from my notes. "Viss has lied, not overtly, but by omission. His knowledge of the manuscript's contents is limited, but not non-existent. He fears not only the men who pursue him, but the implications of what he once did." I leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Holmes gestured toward the fragment of cloth left by the intruder. "Viss, I have reason to believe, once trafficked in antiquities of questionable provenance, relics stolen, altered, or deliberately obscured for private sale. It would explain his access to the painting and his awareness of the Brotherhood's symbols. But more importantly, it would explain why those who now pursue him do so with such zealousness. He was once one of them, or close enough to be complicit." I felt a cold unease stir within me. Then he brought the danger upon himself. "Perhaps," Holmes said, his gaze distant, "but guilt does not preclude victimhood. The question now is whether he seeks redemption or concealment." He leaned back, fingers steepled once more, and I knew from the look in his eye that the time for quiet inquiry was ending. The chase was beginning. It was shortly after 8 o'clock on a bleak and blustery morning that a telegram arrived from the Hotel Langham, its urgent tone unmistakable even before Holmes had broken the seal. As I read over his shoulder, the message chilled me. "Viss gone. Room broken. Come immediately." Within the hour, we were in a cab, the city's November wind lashing against the windows as we raced through the waking streets of London. Upon our arrival, the hotel manager, pale and visibly shaken, met us at the door and led us to Viss's room on the 3rd floor. The scene that greeted us was one of grim disorder. The bedding lay torn and cast aside, a table overturned, and a mirror cracked as though struck in haste or struggle. A trail of broken glass led to the balcony, whose French doors gaped open into the cold grey morning. Holmes moved through the wreckage with quiet urgency, his keen gaze absorbing every displaced item, every subtle shift in the room's natural arrangement. There has been a struggle, he murmured, but not a chaotic one. It was executed with speed and deliberation. Look here, Watson. He pointed to the floor, where a dark scuff mark marred the polished boards. A boot dragged sideways, likely as Viss resisted being pulled. No sign of forced entry, I observed aloud, which suggests either an inside accomplice or that he answered the door himself, not knowing the peril he faced. Holmes straightened. This is no mere disappearance. Viss has been taken, and not by amateurs. We must act swiftly, or he shall not be found at all. Holmes began his examination anew, this time with a narrower focus and an even greater intensity. He drew in close to the balcony doors, where the wind still stirred the drapery like a spectre's sleeve, and crouched low against the floorboards. Observe, he said, this faint smudge of brown beneath the sill, not soil, mud, but with a granular quality that suggests proximity to the Thames, mixed with industrial soot. He moved to the coat stand, now lying on its side. His overcoat is missing. Not packed, not hung. Taken, and with it, likely, the manuscript. I followed his gaze as he lifted a fragment of cloth caught on the edge of a drawer, torn linen, stained faintly with something that might have been blood or ink. But what of motive? I asked. Surely they could have stolen the manuscript without abducting the man. Holmes rose. Unless the man himself holds knowledge they cannot decipher, or unless their purpose is not theft, but silence. He paced to the open window, inhaling deeply. Salt air, he remarked, but fresher than from the Thames alone. There is a trace of brine and a scent of rotting rope, tarred hemp, likely from boat moorings. Whoever took him did not flee into the heart of London. They moved east, towards the docks. He turned to me with that familiar spark of revelation alight in his eyes. There is only one place within a mile where one may enter unseen and vanish with such precision. Come, Watson, the river keeps its secrets, but it cannot hide them forever. We reached the East End before the hour turned, a wretched corner of London, where the buildings leaned like weary men, and the air hung thick with the odours of salt, coal dust, and distant decay. Holmes led with resolute steps along the narrow lanes of Wapping, pausing only once to consult a crude charcoal map he'd sketched in the cab. This was once the haunt of smugglers, he said, gesturing to a low brick structure ahead, half swallowed by fog and grime. Few police venture here unless they must. It is a place for those who do not wish to be seen. The warehouse loomed before us, squat and windowless on its lower level, its upper timbers sagging with age. A rusted padlock hung from the door, broken cleanly, not picked. Holmes ran his fingers over it, then nodded. They've gone in, but they've not returned. We stepped into the gloom, the air within thick with the scent of mouldering wood and stagnant water. Our footsteps echoed across the warped floorboards, broken only by the distant drip of moisture from a rotted beam. There, Holmes said, pointing to the far wall, where deep scuff marks disturbed a patch of dust. A dragline. Something, or someone, was pulled across this space. I knelt beside it and found a torn length of rope, frayed at the ends and still warm to the touch. Holmes walked the perimeter, his eyes scanning the shadows, then paused beside a stack of crates. They held him here, Watson, not long ago, and not without protest. He lifted a rusted crowbar and laid it gently on the floor. They are clever, but not immaculate. We are close now, very close. The atmosphere was thick with dread, and every creak of timber felt like a breath withheld. Holmes's voice dropped to a near whisper. Look here, Watson, along the wall, just behind this beam. He pointed to a cluster of markings, hastily etched in what appeared to be charcoal or soot. There were 3 symbols, a triangle, a slanted line, and a crude drawing of an anchor. Simple, but deliberate. A sailor's code, Holmes explained. common among Dutch dockworkers. This means, danger near, watch the floor. He knelt, inspecting the wooden planks beneath the message, and retrieved a short length of cord, coarse, freshly frayed, and bearing faint indentations. Rope fibres, I murmured. He was bound. Holmes nodded grimly, and yet had the clarity to leave us a warning. Remarkable. A few feet beyond, we found a set of footprints in the grime, partially smeared but clearly belonging to a man dragged backward. The trail ended abruptly beside a broken barrel. They moved him again, Holmes said, but the haste suggests fear, not triumph. There was something deeply unsettling about the place. Not merely the ruin, but the impression that someone, or something, had only just departed, leaving behind the scent of panic and a message scrawled in a final burst of hope. Holmes straightened slowly. "We are walking in another man's last known steps, Watson. We must tread carefully." Holmes froze mid-step, his gaze fixed on the beams above. "Stop," he said, barely above a breath. "Another foot forward, and you'd have met the same fate." Following his eyes, I saw it. A fine wire stretched between two joists, almost invisible in the gloom. Beneath it, a cluster of barrels glistened with something viscous and dark. "Oil," Holmes whispered, "and a timed spark mechanism, crude but effective." He turned to me, face grim. This was no mere hiding place. It was a snare, and whoever set it knew we would come. The danger, it seemed, had only just begun. That night, the fire burned low in our sitting room, casting long shadows on the bookshelves and dancing faintly against the crystal decanter on the table. Holmes sat motionless before it, his long limbs folded inward, chin resting upon steepled fingers and eyes half-lidded, not in sleep, but in intense inward focus. I had grown accustomed to such silences over the years, for I knew them not as signs of inaction, but as the forging ground of conclusions. Still, I could not help but marvel at the scene, the great detective communing with ciphers, letting the embers illuminate symbols that to others would remain indecipherable. "The markings on the warehouse wall," Holmes said suddenly, as though answering a question unasked, "were more than a warning. They were a message intended for us, and us alone." He reached for the notebook upon which he had hastily sketched the symbols in situ, and then from the shelves retrieved a small volume. Merkwaardigheden van de Oud-Zeehandel, a rare Dutch treatise on maritime codes, gifted to him by a grateful client from The Hague. "It is a variant cipher, Watson, a navigational code adapted by smugglers to indicate tide schedules, patrol routes, and rendezvous points. These three figures, see, they correspond to DWH, or De Witte Haven, the White Harbour." I nodded. "The abandoned Dutch import warehouse." "Precisely," he resumed scribbling, transposing the code through a grid of shifting numbers and dated insignia. "And this line beneath it, crude though it is, denotes time. Sun below third mast at evening, that is to say, sunset. A meeting, Watson, one they were eager to conceal." I felt a chill despite the hearth. "And what awaits us there?" Holmes closed the notebook with a soft thud. "If my deductions are sound, not only the culprits, but the purpose behind Vries's silence." He looked into the fire once more, his eyes reflecting its low flame. "Now that we know the place and the hour, the only question that remains is, do we watch or do we act?" The next morning was spent in preparation, though Holmes went about it with a calm so unnerving that I began to suspect he welcomed the confrontation more than he admitted. He dispatched 2 notes before breakfast, one to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard, requesting discreet surveillance at a specified address, and the other to a contact in the East End underworld, whose name I did not know, and whom Holmes referred to only as The lesser devil. After our midday tea, he laid out his findings once again. They have chosen the White Harbour warehouse for a reason, he said. Its isolation, its history, and the fact that it does not appear upon modern registries. It was decommissioned officially, but never demolished. Perfect for a clandestine gathering. And you believe they will meet at sunset? I believe, he said, that they will meet at sunset expecting silence. What they shall find instead is consequence. The plan was elegantly simple. Holmes and I would arrive early, concealed upon the gallery above the warehouse floor. Lestrade's men would encircle the premises at a signal. But it was not brute force Holmes sought. It was confirmation, proof, and, if possible, confession. This is not a raid, Watson. It is a stage, and the villains, if they indeed arrive, must reveal themselves as actors in their own farce. Holmes pocketed his revolver, but looked at it with faint distaste. With luck, it shall remain unfired. For once, we hope that words, well-timed and well-placed, prove the deadlier weapon. Holmes spent the following hours weaving a web no less intricate than the codes he had deciphered. Rather than pursue his quarry with direct accusation, he chose a subtler thread, rumour. Through informants whose names I had heard only in the whispers of past cases, he seeded false intelligence into the alleys and back rooms of East London. To catch a spider, he said as he worked, one must pluck the strands of its own web. The story he crafted was one of betrayal, that the manuscript had been copied, its contents already deciphered, and that a rival collector, named only in whispers, intended to expose the Brotherhood's secrets to the British Museum within the week. He timed the rumours to reach their intended targets by mid-afternoon. Panic, Holmes explained, is more revealing than pride. If they are confident, they will stay hidden. But if they fear exposure, they will move, perhaps recklessly. I watched with growing admiration as he conducted his unseen orchestra of deception. Messages were dispatched. Names were dropped in opium dens and backroom taverns. One informant, whose face I did not see, arrived wearing the smell of the docks and disappeared with a coded phrase Holmes had written on the back of a grocery bill. "You are playing a dangerous game," I said. "Dangerous games are often the shortest route to truth," he replied. By late afternoon, word had returned. Agitation among the Dutchmen. They would attend the meeting after all. Holmes had lit the fuse, and all that remained was to wait for the detonation. As we left Baker Street for the East End, Holmes looked toward the darkening sky. "Tonight, Watson, we shall see whether men hide behind codes for love of secrecy or fear of what the truth might unearth." As we waited in the gallery, above the vast, dim expanse of the White Harbour warehouse, I could not help but observe Holmes in the half-light. He knelt beside me, utterly still, his eyes fixed on the shadowed entrance below, where dust motes drifted through the evening air like particles of time. There was no tension in him, only readiness, a stillness more profound than any outward calm. I marvelled, not for the first time, at how little he resembled the men he so often brought to justice. He was no hunter of glory, no seeker of vengeance, but rather a creature of method, of purpose. In his silence, I could see the full machinery of his mind at work, calculating not just probabilities, but psychology. Holmes did not trap men with force. He trapped them with mirrors, reflections of their own fears, ambitions, and fatal vanities. I recalled his words from earlier. We hope that words, well-timed and well-placed, prove the deadlier weapon. And now we waited, not for the flash of steel or cry of alarm, but for voices that would condemn themselves. I knew then, as I crouched beside him, that whatever unfolded tonight would not be the end of a case. It would be the beginning of understanding, of motives buried beneath layers of secrecy, of truths too long hidden, and of guilt that bore the shape not of violence, but of obsession. I said nothing aloud. I simply waited, as Holmes waited, for the truth to walk in. The air was thick with fog and silence as we approached the decrepit shell of the White Harbour warehouse. It stood in solemn ruin, a ghost of mercantile days long past, its crooked outline emerging like a relic from some forgotten age. The gas lamps cast meagre halos along the alley, but Holmes signalled we go dark, and our approach became one of shadows and breathless stillness. Inspector Lestrade had brought only 4 men, trusted officers known more for discretion than for volume. They took their positions with the economy of experience, forming a loose perimeter with exits covered and retreat paths blocked. Holmes and I moved with care along the eastern flank, where a boarded-up entry offered ingress without announcement. The door yielded to Holmes's slender blade, and we slipped inside, the blackness within folding around us like a cloak. Inside, all was silence, save the echo of our steps on worn planks. From the gallery above, the great space revealed itself gradually, as though reluctant to give up its secrets. The air was rank with mildew, oil, and the distant brine of the river. Holmes placed a hand lightly upon my shoulder and inclined his head toward the lower floor. There, amidst a cluster of crates, a single lantern burned with weak defiance, and beside it, motion. A figure slumped upon a chair, wrists bound. And near him, standing utterly still save for the hand that gripped a revolver with white-knuckled tension, was a man I did not recognize, yet whom I would never forget. Anton Zegers, Holmes whispered, the collector of delusions. The game, long in motion, had finally reached its board, and its players now stood face to face. As we descended silently toward the warehouse floor, the dim light of the lantern revealed more of the tableau. Julian Viss sat bound to a chair with coarse rope, his head bowed, though whether from weariness or terror I could not yet say. A thin trickle of blood marked his temple, where he had evidently been struck. At his side, rigid as marble and deadly still, stood Anton Zegers, a man whose lean figure, drawn features, and hollow gaze bespoke both exhaustion and obsession. The revolver in Zegers's hand did not waver. His eyes, fixed on Viss, flicked up the moment Holmes stepped into view. For an instant, nothing passed between them but silence. Then Zegers spoke, his voice low and brittle. "You were expected," he said. "I knew you would come." Holmes made no immediate reply, only advanced with the calm, unhurried stride of a man accustomed to stepping into rooms charged with danger. His own hands were raised, open and empty. "You are not a murderer, Mr. Zegers," Holmes said softly. "But you are very close to becoming one. Let us speak before that line is crossed." Zegers's jaw clenched, and the revolver shifted minutely in his hand. "Speak then, but be brief. This man," he gestured to Viss, "has betrayed things too sacred for betrayal. He would have sold what should never be seen." Holmes's gaze flicked to Viss, then back to the man who held him. "You are wrong," he said quietly, "and I can prove it." Holmes advanced no further, but he spoke now with the clarity and precision of a man wielding thought as a blade. "You believe the manuscript to be a sacred text, an artifact of power or revelation. Perhaps you even believe it contains evidence to reclaim a lost age. You are mistaken." Zegers' eyes narrowed. "You do not know what it means." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "I have deciphered enough to know exactly what it does not mean." He withdrew from his coat pocket a folded page, an excerpted copy of the manuscript, carefully annotated. "These markings," he said, pointing, "are not esoteric symbols. They are variations of an old Dutch bookkeeping cipher used by mercantile guilds. This manuscript is no religious artifact. It is a ledger, an encoded list of goods traded, routes sailed, and payments made. It is, in short, a business record." Zegers laughed bitterly, though it cracked with strain. That's what he said too. That's what they always say, to protect it, to belittle it, to make it safe again. Holmes's voice did not rise. No one is belittling it. The code is complex, yes, but its purpose is entirely logistical. Hidden, certainly, but not mystical. You have ascribed meaning where there is only method. You lie. I do not. Holmes held the page out, letting the light catch his notes. The brotherhood you serve, if it still exists, may have once believed itself guardian of truth. But what you defend now is not truth. It is obsession. You guard a myth to justify your isolation. And that myth has brought you here, gun in hand, threatening a man who, for all his sins, does not deserve to die. There was silence. Zegers's hand trembled slightly. Holmes spoke again, softer. Put down the weapon. The secrets you seek are not here, and they never were. The words seemed to hang in the stillness, suspended between us like a thread that might snap with the slightest tension. Zegers stared at Holmes, his chest rising and falling in shallow, quickened breaths. The gun wavered, then lowered. I thought it meant something, he said, more to himself than to us. I thought, if I could unlock it, it would justify everything. Holmes took a cautious step forward. Justify what? Zegers looked down at Viss, who now raised his eyes slowly, confusion mingling with pain. My father was one of them, Zegers said, a true believer. He died protecting that ledger, killed for refusing to give it up. All my life I was told it contained knowledge that could bring back what we lost. Power, honor, a way back to something greater. And you pursued it, Holmes said gently. Not for truth, but for purpose. Zegers nodded. When I learned Viss had the manuscript, I believed he had betrayed the order, that he would sell it, disgrace it. I followed him. I watched. I waited. You struck him, I said quietly. He refused to see, or perhaps he saw and didn't care. Holmes turned slightly, his voice now clear and steady. You have just confessed, freely and in full, to attempted abduction, unlawful imprisonment, and assault. Zegers blinked. What? A low voice rang out from the dark, and we heard every word. From the shadows beyond the crates, Lestrade stepped forward, followed by two plainclothes officers. Zegers reeled back, stunned. Holmes turned to me. It seems, Watson, that the mind can create prisons more complete than any cell, but the law, when it listens, can still provide the key. And with that, the lantern's flame flickered, and the case, though not yet closed, had finally turned its face toward resolution. It was a grey and listless morning when we resumed our accustomed places at Baker Street. The events of the previous night had left a quiet solemnity in the air, as though even London itself had paused to reflect upon what had transpired in the darkened warehouse by the river. Viss, released from custody after Lestrade's questioning, had returned briefly to thank us, his manner subdued, his eyes shadowed by the weight of all that had nearly been lost. Holmes, however, was untroubled in manner, if not in thought. He sat by the hearth with the manuscript once more open across his knees. The decoded pages spread like the anatomy of a ghost. His voice was low but deliberate as he addressed me. It is precisely what I told Zegers, Watson. A ledger, nothing more. Encoded, yes, but not to protect divine truths. These entries record shipments, payments, and transactions, some legal, many not, across the ports of Batavia, Curaçao, and the Cape. I leaned forward. But the cipher? A flourish, no doubt, added by a guild fearful of auditors or rivals. But there is no theology here, no mysticism. This is accountancy dressed in velvet robes. I glanced at the faded ink, the elaborate curves of the script, and felt almost cheated by its mundanity. And yet, I said, men died for it. Holmes gave a slow nod. Yes, because it was not what it was, but what they believed it to be. A relic of empire, a key to lost glory. They built their obsessions upon its silence, and that silence grew loud enough to command allegiance, fear, and blood. He folded the manuscript with care, as one might lay a body to rest. Truth, Watson, is rarely as ornamental as the lies built to replace it. Holmes remained seated for some time, the fire casting flickering light against the curve of his cheek, his expression one of remote contemplation. I knew better than to interrupt such moments. They were, in truth, the coda to every case, the inner sorting of pieces too fragile or too personal to speak aloud until Holmes had turned them fully in his mind. "It is remarkable," he said at last, "how men will carve cathedrals from ledgers and call the dust of commerce sacred." He turned his gaze toward the window, where morning struggled to pierce the veil of London fog. Zegers was not mad, not in the way the courts would define it. He was merely desperate for meaning, for continuity, for a myth that might make his inheritance of silence seem profound. The Brotherhood, if it even still functions, needed a steward. He needed a purpose. They found one another. "And Viss?" I asked quietly. Holmes's mouth tightened. A different kind of guilt. He had once trafficked in stolen antiquities, not with malice but with indifference. He told himself he was preserving history, but he knew that he profited from its dismemberment. The moment he saw that manuscript, he recognized its potential, not its truth, but its value to others. And that frightened him. Enough to run, enough to lie, to hide, and when pressed, to risk the lives of others rather than admit his part in the very network that had come to hunt him. There was a silence between us then, thick with what could not be said, for it belonged to the conscience, not the court. Holmes stirred at last. "The manuscript will go to the museum. Let it rest there, unloved and unvisited, as most truths are." And I, for my part, could not help but wonder what other delusions London still kept, waiting only for the right man to believe in them. We lingered in our rooms long after the case had closed, the afternoon light softened by London's ever-present veil of mist. Holmes, seated cross-legged upon the hearth-rug, turned the now irrelevant manuscript over in his hands, not with reverence, but with something approaching weariness. "It is curious," he said, without looking up, "how often men will bind their identities to illusions and call it legacy." I watched as he traced the fading ink with the back of a fingernail. This code, this cipher, was never meant to deceive the world. It was meant only to conceal the unremarkable, a modest veil over routine misdeeds, and yet, through the centuries, it gathered meaning not from its content, but from its silence. He laid the manuscript aside. "It is not the code that confounds men, Watson. It is the mind that projects meaning where none exists. Vanity, pride, the hunger for purpose, they make the ordinary extraordinary until one's very soul is bartered for shadows." I made no reply. There was little to add. And as I observed Holmes, his calm, his certainty, I understood that he had never feared the secrets of men's ledgers. It was their longing to find themselves in them that he pitied most. As I sit now, pen in hand, with the embers of that peculiar case fading into ash, I find myself ruminating not upon the crimes committed, nor the manuscript's contents, but upon the two men who chased it. Julian Viss and Anton Zegers were not, at first glance, alike. One sought to flee the past, the other to resurrect it. One cloaked his guilt in silence, the other his delusion in purpose. And yet both fell prey to the same subtle trap, the belief that meaning could be mined from an object, rather than wrestled from within. In the quiet that followed Zegers' confession, Holmes said nothing further of the case, but I observed him closely, as I always do, and I have learned that silence in my friend is rarely emptiness. It is judgment withheld, reflection carefully weighed. The deepest mysteries, he once told me, are not written in cipher or disguised in paint. They are buried beneath grief, pride, and the loneliness of conviction, and so ends this chapter. Not with arresting clues or scientific marvels, but with the sobering realization that the most elaborate puzzles are wrought not by ink, but by the intricate machinery of the human soul. Holmes and I sat in silence as the last of the fog lifted beyond the window, the fire casting its long, flickering glow upon the now meaningless manuscript that had caused so much fear. "It is curious, Watson," Holmes said at last, "how often men bury their sense of purpose in puzzles not meant to be solved. They mistake complexity for meaning and silence for sanctity." He tapped the folded page with a single finger. "This was never a prophecy, merely a record of trade. But to a man adrift in the world, even a ledger may resemble a scripture." I nodded slowly. And yet, in chasing that illusion, he very nearly became its final entry. Holmes glanced toward the fire. "The most dangerous lies," he murmured, "are the ones we whisper to ourselves." "What do you think was the criminal's greatest mistake? Was it misreading the manuscript, or misjudging the minds of others? I'd love to hear your thoughts, where you're listening from, and what you believe was the turning point in this case. Share your ideas in the comments below. And if you enjoyed the mystery, don't forget to subscribe for more classic Sherlock Holmes cases. And please, share this story with a fellow mystery lover. Let's uncover the next case together.